The first thing that fell off was a sound. A boarding scanner chirped, then chirped again, a half-beat too late. The display above Gate B12 continued its countdown without resetting. The line marker on the floor stayed fixed. No one turned. I was third in line. The counter edge was clean. The metal waste bin beside the podium was open, its liner folded evenly over the rim. A gate agent, Brenda Wilson, stood square to the counter, hands flat, eyes level. The next passenger stepped forward. Her name, I would learn later, was Emily Carter. She looked intentionally neutral. A plain jacket, shoes worn, not dirty. A messenger bag is carried high, zipper closed. She moved at the pace of someone familiar with waiting inside systems that do not explain delays. Emily placed her passport and boarding pass on the counter and aligned them with the edge. The scanner chirped again. Brenda did not touch the keyboard. She looked down at the documents, then up at Emily, then back down. The line held. "You dropped something," Brenda said. The boarding pass had been swept off the counter with a controlled forearm motion that stopped exactly at the edge. The paper landed face down near Emily's shoes. Brenda did not bend or point. She waited. Emily looked down. She paused. Then she bent and picked it up. She brushed the corner once against her thigh and placed it back on the counter. Aligned again. 2 phones rose to chest height and stopped there. Screens dark, hands steady. The scanner chirped a third time. Brenda slid the passport sideways, not back to Emily sideways, toward the open waste bin. The bin was close enough to the counter to receive documents without lifting the arm. The booklet touched metal. The cover dulled under the overhead lighting, the corner closest to the bin losing its sheen. "Is that even allowed?" someone behind me said, low and unfinished. Brenda's hand returned holding a lighter. The flame appeared clean and steady. She angled the booklet so only the corner met the heat. The gold emblem warped. A thin ribbon of smoke rose straight up before bending toward the ceiling vent. "Stop filming," Brenda said. No one lowered their phone. No one raised it higher. The line did not move. Each person appeared to be calculating distance, how close they were to the counter, how visible their face might be if the situation shifted. Emily's bag slipped a few inches on her shoulder. She caught it and settled it back without looking down. Her phone vibrated once against her hip, then again. The tone was distinct, brief, and unfamiliar to the gate environment. She did not reach for it. The flame touched the corner again. Paper darkened. The emblem sagged. The smell changed, sharper, chemical. A maintenance worker approached with a fire extinguisher and stopped when Brenda raised a hand. "Document disposal," she said. "The boarding display has been updated. Flight 447. Boarding. 38 minutes remaining." Emily knelt to retrieve the boarding pass again. A scuff marked the edge where a shoe had passed. She stood and held it loosely, not presenting it yet. "I need to board this flight," she said. "Not with burned documents, you don't," Brenda replied. She nudged the smoldering booklet with a pen. "If it were real, it wouldn't behave like that." A man a few steps back nodded once. "Good catch," he said. Security arrived, then a supervisor. Questions were directed toward Emily, not the bin. Answers were accepted without system checks. Systems down. "We'll need cooperation." Phones away. Emily's phone vibrated again. A different tone this time. As her bag shifted, a small metal chain inside caught the overhead light and disappeared again beneath the fabric. The smoke thinned. The booklet curled inward, pages separating. Flakes settled into the liner. The waste bin became the center of the gate without anyone naming it. The line had stopped advancing, not because it was blocked, but because no instruction had been issued to proceed. The system was occupied. Emily stood with her hands visible, waiting for the next step to be assigned. "I can verify through the system," she said. Brenda did not answer. The supervisor looked into the bin longer than required, then looked away. No one asked what procedure applied when verification materials had already been removed from circulation. Phones remained raised. The gate stayed quiet. And for the first time, it seemed possible that the person everyone believed was being processed was the only one there who understood exactly what sequence had just been triggered. The line did not dissolve when security arrived. It compressed. Shoes shifted half steps forward, then stopped again. The waste bin stayed open. No one closed it. No one asked who was responsible for it now. A security officer positioned himself between the counter and the line, angled toward Emily. His stance blocked the bin without acknowledging it. The supervisor, Janet Phillips, stood just behind Brenda, close enough to read the screen, far enough to avoid the smoke. "What's the situation?" the officer asked. "Fraudulent documents," Brenda said. "Already disposed of." The words settled like a stamp. The officer nodded and turned to Emily. "Ma'am, did you attempt to board with invalid identification?" Emily kept her hands visible. "Those were valid documents." Brenda didn't respond. She reached for a pen and nudged the curled booklet once more, pushing ash deeper into the liner. The action was small, efficient, and final. Janet watched the pen tip, then looked back at Emily's face. "We'll need you to cooperate," Janet said. "Phones away." No one lowered their phone. No one raised it higher. The security officer didn't insist. He adjusted his radio and asked for a second unit. The request sounded procedural, not urgent. The boarding display updated again. 32 minutes remaining. A second officer arrived and took position on Emily's other side. The line marker on the floor was still visible between their shoes. The officer's placement created a corridor that led only toward the counter. The bin remained outside that corridor, untouched by instruction. Emily's phone vibrated. She did not reach for it. "I can verify through the system," she said. "Systems are down," Brenda replied without looking up. Janet didn't challenge it. She asked Emily for alternate identification. Emily shook her head once. "Verification is available through federal databases." The officer glanced at Janet. Janet nodded toward the bin, not the screen. "We'll need to detain you pending review," she said. "Remain here until security completes intake." The boarding display continued counting down. No reference time was entered into the log. The line did not move. A man 2 places behind me whispered to his companion, "If it were real, they wouldn't do that." His companion didn't answer. She checked the distance between her shoes and the floor tape, then looked up at the display. A maintenance worker returned, paused at the edge of the group, and left again. The extinguisher remained unused. The smoke thinned and was pulled toward the vent. Ash clung to the liner in a crescent shape. Another supervisor arrived. Then a gate manager, Tom Reynolds, moving fast enough to signal importance, slow enough to maintain order. He took in the positions first. Officers flanking, Janet behind the counter, Brenda at the screen. Then he looked into the bin. "What's burning at my gate?" he asked. "Fake documents," Janet said. "Handled per protocol." Tom leaned closer. He did not touch anything. Fragments of a photo were still visible, distorted but recognizable as a face. The gold emblem had pooled into metallic droplets at the bottom of the bin. "These are detailed," he said. "High-quality fakes," Brenda replied. "That's how they fool people." Tom straightened and addressed Emily. "Ma'am, you brought counterfeit documents into a secure area. That's serious." Emily nodded once. "I understand." Her phone vibrated again, a different tone. Several heads turned this time. One woman near the seat said quietly, "That's a government phone." "Stolen property," Brenda said. "Part of the scheme." Janet shifted her weight. "We'll examine everything in your bag," she told Emily. "I'd prefer to handle my credentials myself," Emily said. "Criminals don't get preferences," Janet replied. The words landed without emphasis. The officers adjusted their stance. One reached toward Emily's bag and stopped when Tom raised a hand. Tom was looking at the bin again, at the droplets, at the liner folded neatly over the rim. "The boarding display has been updated. 26 minutes remaining." The line behind me remained silent. Phones were now clearly recording. No one spoke to Emily. No one spoke to Brenda. The system had chosen a direction and was advancing it step by step, each action justified by the one before. Emily stood still, centered between the officers, waiting for the next instruction to be issued. "I can verify through the system," she said again. No one answered. Janet checked her watch. Tom looked once more into the bin, then away. The corridor held. The bin stayed open, and it became clear that the escalation was no longer about identification, but about preserving the sequence that had already been entered, one that could not continue without assuming the wrong person was the problem. The corridor did not widen when the call came through. It tightened. The officer nearest Emily glanced at his radio, then at Janet. Janet shook her head once. The bin stayed open. Emily's phone vibrated again. This time she answered. "Johnson," she said. The name cut through the procedural murmur. Not loud, not asserted, just placed. The officer paused mid-sentence. Tom looked up from the bin. Brenda's pen stopped moving. Yes, Emily continued. Gate B12. A beat. Document destruction occurred. The radios went quiet. Janet took a half step back from the counter. The officer who had asked the first question shifted his stance, so he was no longer blocking the bin. Tom cleared his throat. Ma'am, he said, what kind of documents were destroyed? Emily ended the call and set her phone on the counter, screen down. She reached into her bag slowly, using 2 fingers, and withdrew a leather credential wallet. She placed it next to the bin without opening it. The placement mattered. Not toward the officers, toward the evidence. She opened the wallet. The emblem caught the overhead light gold, intact. The title sat beneath it in clean type. The effect was immediate and mechanical. Radios crackled. One officer stepped aside. Another adjusted his posture to neutral. I'm the Chief Inspector, Emily said. Federal Aviation Administration. No one spoke. Not because they were impressed. Because the sequence had changed. Tom leaned in and read again. Then again. He nodded once and raised his hand to the officers. Preserve the scene, he said. No one touches the bin. Janet's voice dropped. Chief Inspector, Emily didn't look at her. Please document the time the passport was placed in the waste bin, she said, and the time the lighter was used. Brenda stared at the liner. Ash clung to it in a crescent. Metallic droplets sat at the bottom, cooled. The pen slipped from her hand and hit the floor. No one picked it up. Who authorized disposal? Emily asked. Silence. Then Janet spoke. It was handled per... Who? Emily repeated. Tom answered. No one authorized destruction, he said. There is no protocol for that. Emily nodded and turned slightly so the cameras could see the bin, the wallet, and the counter edge where the documents had been aligned. Destruction of federal identification is a felony, she said. Interference with a federal investigation is a felony. Preserve all recordings. A pair of marshals arrived within minutes. Their boots stopped at the edge of the corridor. They did not rush. They did not raise their voices. They looked where Emily pointed. Brenda was escorted to a chair. Not pushed. Not argued with. The system no longer needed persuasion. Corporate counsel arrived. Then, more supervisors. Numbers accumulated. The gate did not reopen. The display froze. Emily stood where she had been standing since the corridor formed. She did not move closer to the counter. She did not step back. The bin was sealed. Evidence bags appeared. Labels were filled in. Tom spoke quietly. Chief Inspector, how can we assist? By implementing bias audits at all gates, Emily said, and by retraining staff on document handling, effective immediately. Counsel nodded and wrote. The words were accepted because they now matched authority. The line behind me stayed still until an announcement rerouted the flight. People exhaled without speaking. Phones kept recording. No one cheered. No one clapped. The outcome didn't require it. As the marshals led Brenda away, Ash dusted her sleeve. It was visible on camera, physical, unarguable. Emily closed her credential wallet and returned it to her bag. She picked up her boarding pass creased, scuffed, and held it flat against the counter. A different agent scanned it. The chirp came once, on time. She turned slightly as she passed, not to look at anyone, but to look at the bin one last time. Then she boarded. The gate reset. The liner was replaced. The counter edge was wiped clean. From that morning forward, document handling at this airport was no longer a judgment call, but a log federal procedure. I stayed until the gate status flipped to closed and the incident log finalized. Long enough to watch the sequence complete itself the way it always does when the wrong assumption finally meets the right process. If you've seen a moment like this where procedure is used to humiliate and then defeated by procedure say where it happened, share this story with someone who understands systems. And subscribe to Black CEO Tales for more quiet reckonings like this.